I think I also do a bit in shameless self-promotion, because I will talk about the 6 countries we have been talking about with Edgar and Sven for many years. 6 countries in Northwestern Europe, 5 of which had elections last year. So I will talk about the latest trends based on our analysis of these 5, plus the Swiss elections 2015. And I will give you some theoretical ideas, which most of you are probably familiar with. Then data and methods you are familiar with, but the results are really something new. And the ideas start with the long-term trends of party competition in Northwestern Europe. As we have said many times, we think there are 2 waves of political mobilization that have swept across Northwestern Europe since the 1970s. In the 70s and 80s, it was the new social movements, which had their repercussions in the party system in the form of new left parties, the Greens. And then in the 80s until the 2000s, the radical populist right swept or started to sweep across Europe, especially the northwest of Europe. And we now attempt to call it the new right in the party system. Both the new left and the new right had in common that they focused mainly on cultural and not on economic issues. The new left focused on cultural liberalism, the new right on European integration and immigration. And the mobilization of these 2 led to a transformation of cultural conflicts in party competition. Traditionally, the cultural conflict was mainly focused on religion, but because of the mobilization of these 2 new types of parties, it was increasingly focused on what Jorge Marx used to call Galtan. Still, but now you talk about transnational cleavage. We said it's integration, demarcation. Simon Borngier said it's universalism, particularism. I think we all meant the same. And we are actually very close in our thinking, as you will see this afternoon. So this led to a tripolar configuration in the party system, because the new right split the right into the moderate right and the national conservative or radical populist right, whereas the new left was pretty closely situated to the social democratic or more moderate left. Now the question is, did the Great Recession reverse these long-term trends? And there are 3 reasons why this is not to be expected. First of all, the limited scope of the Great Recession in Northwestern Europe. In 2008-2009, the impact was very important in these countries too, but they recovered rather rapidly. Secondly, the way the euro crisis was managed in terms of macroeconomic policy making was in the sign of there is no other alternative. So this idea that we had to do austerity was shared by the center-left and the center-right, which led to further convergence in economic terms and left more room for cultural competition. And third, the way the euro crisis was managed also pitted creditor states against debtor countries, which reinforced nationalism and which reinforced long-term cultural trends, we would argue. So the long-term trends might have temporarily been dampened, but not reversed. They were, however, reinforced, our argument, by the refugee crisis and by Brexit crisis. These crises increased the salience of core issues of the new right. And the strategy of the moderate right also reinforced these long-term trends, because in competition with the new right, the moderate right tended increasingly to move in the same direction on the cultural dimension. Now, still, the Great Recession might have reinforced economic conflict, by inciting shifts to the left on non-macroeconomic issues, on labor market issues, so opposition to liberalizing reforms, on social policy issues such as opposition to retrenchment or support for social investment policies, and that not only by the center-left and the radical left, for which these issues belong to their traditionally defended issues. They have ownership of these issues, so for them it might have been a great chance for renewal, but also for the new right, because the new right clientele was very hard hit by the crisis, and precisely these people might have been catered to by a new shift of the new right in economic terms to the left. And finally, the moderate left had already started to shift to the left, to converge. So the convergence on the economic dimension was not just the Social Democrats moving to the right, it was also the Christian Democrats moving to the left, and that might have been reinforced by the crisis. There are some conditioning factors. Obviously, the electoral system plays a role. Majoritarian systems have a bipolarizing tendency, whereas proportional systems allow for tripolar structures. There are a lot of contingent factors, and in the paper we mentioned just two. The first one is co-responsibility for austerity of center-left parties in grand coalitions. In 4 of our 6 countries, during most of the Great Recession, there were grand coalitions. And the center-left was co-responsible as part of these grand coalitions for the austerity policy. And as we know from the literature on Latin America, this might hurt the center-left greatly. Secondly, this also, we think, reinforces bipolarization between the cluster of moderate parties on the one hand and the new right on the other hand. And the second contingent factor concerns the programmatic differentiation of the left on the economic dimension. I said the Great Recession provided a great opportunity for the left to move to the left on the economic dimension, and that might have been an especially good opportunity for the radical left to differentiate itself from the social democratic left, which would have the result of a multipolar system. You would have the radical left versus the center-right on the economic dimension, and the new left versus the new right on the cultural dimension. So much for the ideas. Now, how about data? We have done what we have done all the time, content analysis of electoral campaigns. In these 6 countries, we have 48 elections, 1 benchmark election in the 1970s, and then all elections from 1988 to 2017. We have about 60,000 actor issue sentences, and we have 2 types of operationalizations, which I will present to you. First of all, we measure the politicization of specific issues. That is the structuring capacity of issues, which we operationalize by the product of salience and polarization. So it's a sort of weighted polarization measure. The weight is the salience of the issue. And our second operationalization is the structuration of party competition as shown in multidimensional scaling. We have specific indicators which we developed for this paper. They might be a bit tricky, but I just show you the pictures. Now the results. First of all, the structuring capacity of economic and new cultural issues overall across the 6 countries. On the left, you have the 3 cultural issues: cultural liberalism, immigration, and Europe. And the solid line is immigration. And on the right, you have the 2 economic issues: welfare and economic liberalism. Now, on the left, what do you see? You see that the 3 lines first peak in the 1990s, then there is a little stagnation of the 3 issues, and towards the end of the period, with the last elections which we are talking about here in 2017, you see a surge in the politicization of immigration. You see a surge in the other two issues as well, but more moderate than for immigration. But we take this as a confirmation of the long-term trend. So there was a dampening, you might say, of the politicization on these new issues during the Great Recession, but since then, in the sign of the subsequent crisis, the politicization rose a lot. What you see on the right is increase during the crisis of the politicization of economic issues, but the increase is very moderate. In the last elections, there is again a decline of the politicization of these issues. If we look at each country separately, we see the development is not linear in each country, not as nice as if we take them overall. And there are two exceptions to the general trends. There is European integration in Switzerland, and there is immigration in France. And also the development is rather muted in Great Britain. And that is interesting because Great Britain internalizes, because it's a two-party system, a lot of these politicization is internalized into the major parties, and our measures are inter-party measures. So we don't pick that up with our measures. Now the shifting overall configuration. What we find and what we think is a new finding is a trend toward bipolarism. Because we always talked about tripolar configurations, and what we see in the last elections is a trend toward bipolarism. And that has to do with the fact that the two dimensions are increasingly aligned. So you have pro-welfare and pro-cultural liberalism, pro-European integration, anti-immigration pro-immigration positions, the cosmopolitan left going together. And on the other hand, you have economically liberal, culturally conservative, Eurosceptic, and anti-immigration positions going together. So this would be a revival of Kitschel's winning formula for the new right. And you get a polarization between the left and the new right, with the center-right positioned in between and moving towards the new right. Yes, I have to speed up. Just look at these pictures. You see the correlation of the two dimensions, and then you see a triangular shapes, gray shapes, which link the center left, the center right, and the new right. And you see that these triangles are, in general, very flat. I mean, in the Austrian case, that's the first graph on the top on the left, it's a straight line. These are indications of bipolarism. You have the left opposed to the new right with the center-right in between, the ÖVP moving to the FPÖ. That's the paradigmatic case, but I just want to point out the case of France for you, because it's extremely interesting. République en Marche has a position which is almost identical to the Parti Socialiste. So you get a cluster of moderate left which is opposed to the Front National, et les Républicains are in between, very similar to what we see for Austria in the case of France. The only exception to the general picture we draw is the Netherlands, because the Netherlands is the one country where you get this differentiation on the left between the radical left, the new left, and the center left, and you get a multipolar system. So I shift and come to the conclusion, may I?
Yes, 1 minute.
1 minute. The long-term trends have been enhanced in spite of the dampening effect of the Great Recession. There is a return to bipolarism in 4 out of the 6 countries. And the tripolar configurations may have been temporary, characteristic of a transition period. I find this very surprising, because I just read a book on the French elections. I have to say this. A book on the French elections, Le Vote Disruptif, where the editor in his introduction says, finally we have a tripolar system. So I conclude with this. Thank you for your attention.